Somewhere in the flooded cypress of southwest Florida, a radio transmitter is still beeping. It was surgically implanted in a young Burmese python, one of the most destructive invasive predators on the planet, so that scientists could finally understand where these snakes go, how far they roam, and how to stop them. For weeks, the signal told a normal story. Movement, rest, movement, rest. Then one day, it stopped moving the way a living snake moves. And when the research team finally traced it, they weren't looking at a python anymore. They were looking at an X-ray of one of Florida's smallest, most overlooked native predators, with a python spine curled up inside its stomach. This is the story of how that discovery happened, what it says about the Everglades fight for survival, and why the animal responsible is one almost nobody saw coming. To understand why a small native pit viper eating a python made headlines, you first have to understand exactly what Florida has been dealing with since the 1980s and 90s. Burmese pythons, Python vivittatus, are native to the swamps, grasslands, and river deltas of Southeast Asia, where they can grow to enormous size. Some individuals have been documented exceeding 18 feet and 200 pounds. They arrived in Florida largely through the exotic pet trade. Animals bought young and small that outgrew their owner's ability or willingness to keep them, some released deliberately, others escaping during storms. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 is widely cited as accelerating the spread, having damaged breeding and holding facilities in South Miami-Dade County. By the early 2000s, pythons had established a self-sustaining breeding population across Everglades National Park and the surrounding wetlands. The U.S. Geological Survey now describes them as one of the most concerning invasive species in the region, competing directly with native wildlife for food and space across an ecosystem that never evolved any defense against them. The damage is not subtle. A landmark 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researchers from Davidson College and the USGS, compared road survey wildlife counts from 1996 to 1997 to counts taken from 2003 to 2011 along the same routes. Site index equals 12-1. The researchers documented a 99.3% decrease in raccoon observations, along with decreases of 98.9% for possums and 87.5% for bobcats. And they failed to detect any rabbits at all during the later surveys/site. Marsh rabbits and gray foxes, once common, simply weren't there anymore. A follow-up study published in 2015 by University of Florida and USGS researchers using radio-tracked marsh rabbits found that site index equals 18-1. Nearly 80% of the rabbits that died during the study were killed by Burmese pythons. And a year later, there was no detectable rabbit population left in the study area at all/site. Estimates of the total python population in South Florida vary widely because the animals are so difficult to detect. Figures from independent research have ranged from roughly 30,000 into the hundreds of thousands. What isn't in dispute is the scale of the ecological disruption, or the difficulty of removing the snakes once established. Since organized python removal programs began, contractors and competition hunters working with the state and with groups like the Conservancy of Southwest Florida have pulled thousands of pythons out of the wetlands. And biologists routinely describe that effort as barely denting the underlying population, because the snakes are so effectively camouflaged in the vegetation they now call home. If you can't easily find pythons by searching for them, the next best option is to make the pythons lead you to each other. And that's the strategy behind one of the most important python research programs in Florida. The radio telemetry work run by the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. The approach is sometimes called the Judas snake or scout snake method. Male pythons are captured, fitted with surgically implanted radio transmitters, and released. During breeding season, these males instinctively seek out females, and researchers follow the signal straight to breeding aggregations, which lets them remove multiple snakes, including large reproductive females, at once. Conservancy biologist Ian Bertashek has described finding mating balls of a dozen or more pythons tangled together using exactly this method. But the same transmitter technology used to hunt down adult breeding pythons has also been applied more broadly, implanting trackers in captured pythons of various ages and life stages, then following their movements over weeks and months to understand python ecology, how far they range, what habitat they prefer, and, crucially, what happens to them in the wild. That last question is what led researchers to something nobody expected. Between July and September 2020, researchers working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey captured young Burmese pythons in Picayune Strand State Forest in southwest Florida, surgically implanted radio transmitters, and released the animals back at their capture sites roughly 24 hours later. A standard protocol for minimizing stress on the animal while allowing its movements to be monitored going forward. One of those transmitters told a strange story. The location kept updating. The equipment was clearly functioning, but the pattern of movement no longer matched what a python does in the wild. Researchers converged on the signal and found not a python, but an adult Florida cottonmouth, Adcastrodon piscivorus conanti, with the transmitter and the python that carried it inside its digestive tract. It happened again in May 2021, this time in Big Cypress National Preserve, when a second radio-tagged juvenile python's transmitter led biologists to another adult cottonmouth. Site index equals 5-1. Zoo Miami's communications director Ron McGill later confirmed to Newsweek that the python had been consumed by a cottonmouth in Picayune Strand State Forest, and that it was being tracked as part of an invasive species study run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey/site. Site index equals 7-1. McGill explained that in tracking the python, researchers were led to an adult cottonmouth at Big Cypress National Preserve, and that what they suspected, that the cottonmouth had eaten the python, was later confirmed by X-ray/site. Both cottonmouths were captured, transported to Zoo Miami's Animal Hospital, and X-rayed. Site index equals 3-1. The radiographs, according to Reptiles magazine, provided verification of the venomous snake having eaten a radio-telemetered Burmese python. One observation from 2020 in Picayune Strand State Forest, and one from 2021 in Big Cypress National Preserve/site. Site index equals 6-1. Zoo Miami shared one of the X-rays publicly, noting that the spine and transmitter of the python were both visible inside the cottonmouth's body/site. In the more thoroughly documented case, researchers noted the python had been swallowed tail first, an important detail, because it tells you something about how the strike and swallow sequence actually unfolded. It's worth being precise here about scale, because some retellings of this story have exaggerated it into something closer to fiction. These were not full-grown, double-digit foot pythons being swallowed whole by a snake a fraction of their size. The pythons involved were young, recently hatched, or juvenile animals, the size class most vulnerable to predation before they grow large enough to become nearly untouchable. Site index equals 3-1. One of the cottonmouths involved, a female, measured 63 centimeters snout to vent and 74 centimeters in total length and weighed 317 grams. The second measured between 87 centimeters snout to vent and 108 centimeters total length/height. That's a meaningfully sized adult cottonmouth. Florida cottonmouths can run close to a meter or slightly beyond in exceptional cases, successfully overpowering and consuming a young python roughly proportional to its own size. That's still a genuinely remarkable predation event. It just isn't the swamp monster versus apex predator showdown that some viral retellings have implied. Scientists who documented the events, publishing their findings in the journal Herpetological Review, noted that site index equals 9-1. Burmese pythons are established in the greater Everglades ecosystem in southern Florida, and that documented predators on pythons in the state already included the American alligator, the Gulf Coast indigo snake, the bobcat, and possibly the Florida black bear, before the cottonmouth predation events were recorded during radiotelemetry studies of hatchling and juvenile pythons/site. Most people who grew up anywhere near a southern swamp know exactly one fact about the cottonmouth. It's venomous, and you leave it alone. That reputation is well earned, but it also flattens an animal that is, biologically speaking, one of the more specialized predators in North America. Florida cottonmouths are pit vipers, a family that includes rattlesnakes and copperheads, and they are the only broadly aquatic member of that family found in North America. They hunt comfortably in water and on land, moving through the same flooded prairies, cypress strands, and slow-moving creeks that young pythons use as cover. Adults typically run in the range of 2.5 to 4 feet, occasionally larger, and they're heavy-bodied for their length. Like other pit vipers, cottonmouths have heat-sensing pits between the eye and nostril that let them detect infrared radiation from warm-blooded prey, and importantly, from ectothermic prey that has recently been basking or is generating metabolic heat from digestion, which include snakes. Their venom is hemotoxic, meaning it breaks down blood cells and tissue rather than attacking the nervous system the way many elipid venoms do. In practical terms, that means a cottonmouth's usual hunting strategy isn't to grapple with prey. It's to deliver a bite, withdraw, and let the venom do the disabling work before the snake commits to swallowing. Cottonmouths are also fundamentally snake eaters. Ophiophagy, snake-eating snake predation, is a well-documented part of the species' natural diet, alongside fish, frogs, small mammals, and carrion. From that angle, a cottonmouth encountering and killing a small, unfamiliar snake in its own territory isn't really a break from its established behavior. It's closer to an ambush predator with excellent sensory tools for finding ectothermic prey, simply adding a new item, juvenile Burmese pythons, to a menu of snake prey it was already equipped to exploit. That's precisely why researchers found the 2020 and 2021 cases so significant. Not because a cottonmouth did something wildly out of character, but because it demonstrated, with hard physical evidence, that Florida's native predators were already capable of exploiting an invasive species that had gone functionally unchecked by nearly everything else in the ecosystem. The cottonmouth cases landed the biggest headlines because of the X-rays, but they're part of a wider, and still growing, body of evidence that Florida's native wildlife is adapting to prey on pythons wherever the opportunity arises. Alligators are the most established python predator in the Everglades, and the relationship between the two species has gone in both directions. There is well-documented footage of pythons killing and consuming alligators, and separate documentation of alligators killing pythons. Site index equals 9-1 peer-reviewed observations have specifically credited the American alligator as a documented predator of Burmese pythons in Florida/site, alongside the Gulf Coast indigo snake and the bobcat. The bobcat case is one of the more striking recent additions to that list. In 2021, trail cameras placed by Conservancy of Southwest Florida biologists captured footage of an adult bobcat approaching an active python nest, driving off the brooding female, and systematically raiding and consuming the eggs, the first photographic documentation of a native mammal directly attacking a python nest, rather than scavenging an abandoned one. Site index equals 2-1. Zoo Miami referenced that footage directly when it shared the cottonmouth X-ray publicly, noting that people may have already heard about the bobcat that was documented stealing and consuming eggs from an invasive Burmese python in the Everglades, and that the cottonmouth wasn't the only native species fighting back/site. Florida black bears have also turned up as possible python predators in the same body of research. Site index equals 9-1. With peer-reviewed work identifying the Florida black bear as a possible predator based on evidence collected during the same radiotelemetry studies/site. Though the evidence for bears is less conclusive than for alligators, indigo snakes, bobcats, and cottonmouths. None of these predation events, on their own, is going to reverse the python invasion. But taken together, they describe something ecologists rarely get to observe directly: a native food web responding in real time to a novel invasive predator, using existing behaviors and sensory adaptations that happen to transfer well to a new kind of prey. It's tempting to read a story like this as evidence that nature is quietly solving the python problem on its own. The reality documented by researchers is more sobering. Burmese pythons reproduce prolifically. Clutch sizes can run into the dozens of eggs, and hatchlings emerge already large enough, at over 2 feet, to begin hunting almost immediately. Female pythons also grow large enough to eat prey far bigger than most people assume. Site index equals 4-1, a 2024 study published in the journal Reptiles and Amphibians, conducted by Conservancy of Southwest Florida biologists, documented a female python measuring 14.8 feet and weighing 115.2 pounds, consuming a white-tailed deer weighing nearly 77 pounds, roughly 2/3 of the snake's own body mass/site, showing that adult pythons can exploit far more of the Everglades food web than researchers had previously realized. Bertashek, one of the study's authors, put the stakes plainly. Site index equals 4-1. Watching an invasive apex predator swallow a full-size deer is something you don't forget, and the impact the python is having on native wildlife can't be denied, calling it a defining wildlife issue for the greater Everglades ecosystem/site. Cottonmouths, bobcats, alligators, and the occasional indigo snake are, for now, primarily preying on the smallest and most vulnerable size class of pythons, hatchlings and juveniles. The same group human removal efforts struggle most to find and remove. That's genuinely useful, because every young python that doesn't survive to breeding age is one less animal producing another clutch of dozens of eggs. But it isn't enough on its own to reverse a population that federal researchers have estimated may run into the tens of thousands across South Florida's wetlands. Human removal efforts continue in parallel. Florida's annual Python Challenge, along with year-round contracted hunters working for the South Florida Water Management District and other agencies, has removed thousands of pythons from the wild since organized efforts began. Conservancy of Southwest Florida's Scout Snake program alone has been credited with removing a significant number of large breeding females, the animals with the greatest impact on future population growth, since a single female removed before breeding season prevents an entire clutch of eggs from ever being laid. What the cottonmouth cases actually prove isn't that the Everglades has found its answer to the python invasion. It's that the ecosystem hasn't given up, that native predators, working with nothing but instinct and heat-sensing pits evolved for a completely different world, are already finding ways to push back against an invader that arrived with no natural checks at all. A hemotoxic bite from a 2.5-foot pit viper isn't going to undo 4 decades of ecological damage. But it's a reminder that even the most overlooked animal in the swamp, the one people warn you to step around and otherwise ignore, can turn out to be carrying more weight in this fight than anyone expected.